Have you ever stepped into the shower expecting nothing but a few quiet minutes, and suddenly your mind starts talking to someone who isn't there? You begin explaining something, maybe defending yourself, maybe winning an argument that never actually happened. Sometimes the conversation is with someone you saw earlier today. Sometimes it is with someone from years ago. And sometimes it with someone you might meet tomorrow. Strangely, in your mind, you say exactly the right thing. The perfect explanation. The perfect comeback. The perfect sentence you wish you had said earlier. And if you pay attention, something even stranger happens. These rehearsed conversations appear most often in places where the world becomes quiet. In the shower, during late night walks, while lying awake at night. Why does the mind stimulate conversations that might never happen? And why do these rehearsals feel so real that your emotions sometimes react as if the conversation is actually happening? The answer is not random. It comes from something very old inside the human brain. Something that evolved long before modern life existed. And once you understand what your brain is actually doing, these strange imaginary conversations will start to make a lot more sense. The human brain is often described as a thinking machine, but in reality, its main job is something else entirely: prediction. Your brain is constantly trying to answer one silent question: what might happen next? Thousands of years ago, this ability could mean the difference between survival and death. Imagine walking through a forest thousands of years ago. If a predator suddenly appeared, reacting in that moment might already be too late. So the brain developed a powerful strategy. Instead of waiting for events to happen, it began imagining them first. What if danger appears from the left? What if someone from another tribe approaches? What if the group leader becomes angry? The brain would run through possible situations before they actually happened. In other words, the brain becomes a stimulation engine. And even today, your brain still works the same way. But modern life has changed the type of threat we face. Most people today do not worry about predators. Instead of the biggest risk often involves something else. Social situations, conversations, embarrassment, conflict, being misunderstood. And so the brain uses its ancient stimulation ability for something new. It practices conversations. But if the brain is simply practicing conversations, why does it choose place like the shower to do it? The answer reveals something fascinating about how the mind works. The shower creates a very unusual mental environment. Three important things happen at the same time. First, distractions disappear. There are no screens, no notifications, no conversations. The brain is suddenly free from constant stimulation. Second, something repetitive begins. the sound of water, the warmth of steam, the steady rhythm of droplets. Repetition has a calming effect on the brain. It lowers mental tension. It relaxes the system that normally controls attention. Third, the brain enters a drifting state. This state activates a system scientists call the default mode network. This network becomes active when you are not focused on a specific task. It activates when you are daydreaming, reflecting, imagining the future, thinking about yourself. When this network turns on, something interesting happens. Your mind begins exploring ideas, memories, and possibilities. And this is when the brain begins rehearsing scenarios. But there is another mystery. If the brain is imagining possible future, why are those scenarios so often conversations or arguments? The answer goes back to one of the most important parts of human evolution. Humans are one of the most social species on earth. For most of human history, survival depended on belonging to a group. Being part of a group means safety, shared food, protection, cooperation. But being rejected by the group could be extremely dangerous. Isolation thousands of years ago meant losing protection. It meant losing resources. Sometimes it meant death. Because of this, the human brain becomes extremely sensitive to social situations. Saying the wrong thing could damage your reputation. Misunderstanding someone could create conflict. Failing to defend yourself could lower your status. So the brain developed a system to prevent social mistakes. It began reviewing conversations, replaying them, and imagining how they could go better next time. This is why your brain sometimes revisits the conversation from earlier in the day. It is analyzing them, searching for improvements, trying to prepare for the future interactions. But there is something curious about these rehearsed scenarios. In your imagination, you usually win the conversation. Why does the brain create situations where you always have the perfect answer? When your brain imagines a conversation, it controls both sides of the interaction. It decides what the other person says, and it decides what you say in response. Because of this, the brain can construct a scenario where your explanation becomes clearer. Your arguments become stronger. Your response becomes more confident. This is not simply wishful thinking, it is rehearsal. Just like an athlete practices movements before a competition. Your brain practices words before social interaction. These imagined victories are actually experiments. Your brain is testing your strategies. Which response sounds stronger? Which explanation feels clearer? Which argument seems more convincing? The mind is quietly preparing you for situations that might happen later. But rehearsal is not the only reason the brain creates these imagined conversations. Something else is happening beneath the surface, and it might explain why these thoughts sometimes appear right before sleep. Many people notice something interesting. These imagined conversations do not only appear in the shower, they also appear late at night, when the room becomes quiet, when the world slows down. Why? Because the brain becomes less occupied with external information. During the day, your senses are constantly processing movements, sounds, and activity. But at night, the brain has more internal space. And when that space appears, the mind often begins exploring unfinished experiences. Psychologists sometimes call this cognitive closure. The brain prefers completed stories. If something feels unresolved, the mind keeps returning to it, rehearsing explanations, relaying possibilities, searching for a better ending. But here is something even more fascinating. These imagined scenarios are not only about solving problems. Sometimes they are connected to creativity. Many people report their best ideas appearing in the shower. Scientists have studied this phenomenon, and they found that relaxed mental states allow different brain regions to communicate more freely. Memories combine with imagination, ideas connected in unexpected ways. This is why writers, scientists, and artists often experience insight during the simple activities like walking or showering. The brain becomes flexible, creative, and exploratory. Those imagined conversations may sometimes be the mind of exploring new perspectives, testing different ways of thinking, trying out new explanations. So, the next time you notice yourself having a full conversation in the shower, explaining something to someone who is not there, winning an argument that never happened, remember this. Your brain is not being strange, it is doing exactly what it evolved to do, preparing for the future, learning from the past, and practicing the words you might say someday need. In the quiet rhythm of falling water, the mind finally has space to rehearse life. As we reach the end of this exploration, it helps to step away from the story for a moment and look at what researchers actually tell us about this strange habit of the human mind. The idea that the brain rehearses imagined situation is not just a philosophical observation. It's supported by several areas of psychology and neuroscience. One of the most important discoveries involves something scientists call the default mode network. This is a group of brain regions that become active when the mind is not focused on an external task. In other words, when you are not solving a problem, reading something, or concentrating on work, the brain automatically shifts into this internal mode. Researchers discovered that during this state, the brain begins doing three things repeatedly. First, it reflects on past experiences. Second, it imagines possible future. And third, it evaluates social situations involving other people. This explains why imagined conversations often appear when your environment becomes quiet. When the brain is no longer busy, the default mode network begins running internal simulations. These simulations often take the form of conversation, explanations, or arguments. Another scientific concept that helps explain this is known as mental simulation. Mental simulation is the brain's ability to imagine events before they actually occur. Psychologists have found that humans frequently simulate situations in order to prepare for them. Athletes imagine movements before competitions. Public speakers mentally rehearse speeches. Students sometimes imagine answering questions before an exam. The brain treats this imagined event as a form of practice. Interestingly, brain scans show that when people imagine performing an action, many of the same brain regions activate as when they perform the action physically. This means that imagined rehearsal is not just fantasy. To some degree, the brain processes it as a real experience. Another important explanation comes from the field of evolution psychology. This field studies how the human mind was shaped by the survival challenges faced by our ancestors. For early humans, social relationships were extremely important. Living in small groups meant cooperation was necessary for survival. But it also meant social mistakes could have serious consequences. Losing trust, damaging your reputation, or creating conflict within the group. Because of this, the brain evolved to pay the special attention to social interactions. Psychologists sometimes refer to human as a social prediction species. Our brain constantly analyzes the intentions, reactions, and possible responses of other people. This is why imagined scenarios often involve conversations. The brain is attempting to predict how social situations might unfold. Another concept connected to this behavior is something called prospection. Prospection refers to the brain's ability to imagine possible future. Unlike many other animals, humans are extremely skilled at thinking about events that have not happened yet. This ability allows us to plan, to prepare, and sometimes to worry. Prospection is one of the reasons human-built civilization make long-term plans and imagine possibilities far beyond the present moment. But the same ability also means the brain spends a lot of time exploring scenarios that might never occur. Sometimes these imagined futures are useful. They help us prepare for difficult conversations. They help us organize our thoughts. They help us learn from past experiences. But sometimes they simply reflect the brain's habit of exploring possibilities. Another interesting finding comes from the studies of memory. Researchers discovered that remembering the past and imagining the future use of many of the same brain system. When people recall an event from their past, the brain constructs the memory. When they imagine a future situation, a brain uses those same pieces to construct something new. In other words, the mind is constantly combining memory and imagination. This is why imagined conversations often include people we already know. Our brain uses familiar experience as building blocks for the future simulations. Scientists have also noticed that certain environments encourage this type of thinking. Activities that involve simple, repetitive, often allow the mind to wander. Walking, driving long distances, washing dishes, and of course, standing in the shower. When the body performs a routine activity, the brain has more freedom to explore internal thoughts. This mental wandering is sometimes called mind wandering, and it occupies a surprisingly large portion of human thinking. Some studies suggest that people spend nearly half of their waking time thinking about something other than what they are currently doing. Does not necessarily mean the brain is distracted. It may actually be performing useful mental work, evaluating experience, simulating possibilities, preparing for the future events. There is also evidence that these mental simulations can improve performance in the real situations. Psychologists studying visual techniques found that mentally rehearsing a task can increase confidence and clarity when the real moments arrives. This may explain why your brain practices conversation in a private moments. It is trying to prepare for your responses before the real interaction happens. Of course, not every imagined scenario is helpful. Sometimes the brain becomes trapped in repeated negative simulations. This can lead to rumination, where the mind replays the same thought again and again. But even this behavior has evolutionary roots. The brain evolved to detect problems and potential threats. If something feels unresolved, the mind keeps returning to it, searching for a better outcome. From an evolutionary perspective, this persistence may have helped our ancestors to avoid repeating dangerous mistakes. Today, it simply appears as overthinking, but beneath the surface, the brain is still performing the same ancient function. It is trying to learn, adapt, and prepare. When you understand this, those strange imaginary conversations begin to look very different. They are not meaningful distractions. They are the mind's attempt to explore possibilities, to refine ideas, and to prepare for the unpredictable nature of human interaction. So the next time you notice yourself explaining something to an invisible audience, or replaying a conversation while standing under a running water, remember that the habit is deeply connected to how the human brain works. Your mind is simulating possibilities, testing responses, and quietly preparing you for the future that has not yet arrived. In the quiet moments of everyday life, the brain continues doing what it has always done, imagining, learning, and rehearsing the story of what might happen next.